Hello? Did it go live? I clicked go live, but it didn't give my usual countdown. 3, 2, 1, going live. What happens if I... Oh, computer. I love you so much. Okay. I have to ask my tech support whether it's actually going. Okay, yep, I'm on. So whatever the computer's doing, at least it's recording. So we will continue. That's the good thing about knowing your wife is always watching. Is there something? No, that's something else. Okay, too many different notifications. All right. So how's everyone doing today? Good, I hope. It is time for our journey into a wonderful topic of the Nazirite vow. Nazirut, as it's called in Hebrew. Before we get into that, though, I don't want to forget, just a reminder, this is our last class until July 17th, because I'll be on the Congregational Israel trip, followed by my vacation. So please continue to study. Just because we're not studying each week together doesn't mean the Torah stops. It just means we won't have a chance to study them together. Some of these parshiot, depending upon where they are in my back catalog on YouTube. So if you absolutely have to have your fix, I think you can find a copy of a study for just about all of these. But this is the time I usually take off for vacation, so there may be a couple weeks that are still missing. Someday I'll have to mix it up a bit just to get a few of these covered that are in the middle. All right. So Nazirites. What does it mean to be a Nazir? And most of the time I'm going to be using the Hebrew word because it's just easier to say a Nazir than a Nazirite. This is going to be an unusual circumstance. It's one that I should point out that we do not engage in this current time. That is to say, a person should not be taking a Nazirite vow at this moment in time, but it still has a lot to teach us, despite its seeming oddity. Maybe we should get into the Torah itself, since this is something that people are perhaps a little less familiar with than other aspects of the Torah. So we are on page 799. We are in Parshat Naso, and we are going to begin with chapter 6, right at the beginning. 799. And I'll need a reading volunteer. I see a hand.
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, if anyone, man or woman, explicitly utters a Nazirite's vow to set himself apart for the Lord, he shall abstain from wine and any other intoxicant. He shall not drink vinegar of wine or of any other intoxicant. Neither shall he drink anything in which grapes have been steeped, nor eat grapes fresh or dry. Throughout his term as Nazirite, he may not eat anything that is obtained from the grapevine, even seeds or skin."
Okay. So, what are the conditions so far that we have for being a Nazir?
Stay away from grapes
So
of any
far,
kind.
Wine, which will include
Any
grapes,
Right.
seeds, skins, etc. Even things that are not alcoholic, but are associated with the generation of alcohol through grapes, are things that we will not be having if you are a Nazir. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. We'll come back to maybe why this is the case in a little bit, but that is our first condition so far.
Or any other toxic.
Or other
Any other.
wine.
Or beer.
Spirits.
Well, does that mean all grain?
No. So wine is the primary form of an intoxicant in the ancient world, at least at this stage in Jewish history. So yes, they did have other types of grain alcohols and that, but wine was by far and away the most common form of intoxicant at the time. And it was Also, I always like to remind people of this. Wine is considered to be the actual form of the consumable grape in the ancient world. The idea of table grapes, as we enjoy them, did not really exist at the time. Grapes were not enjoyable straight from the vine because they were considered to be, not very tasty. We have selectively bred our grapes over the last few thousand years to make them much nicer straight from the vine. But to this day, if you go into Napa Valley or Bordeaux in France or whatever, and you pick a grape off one of those vines for a wine manufacturer, you will be disappointed in what that grape will taste like. It's not going to taste like what the table grapes you get at Publix. So wine was what grapes were supposed to be, but even the other bits of grapes that had been turned into wine, a Nazirite, a Nazir would still avoid eating. Good. Onward.
Throughout the term of his vow as Nazirite, no razor shall touch his head. It shall remain consecrated until the completion of his term as Nazirite of the Lord, the hair of his head being left to grow untrimmed. Throughout the term that he has set apart for the Lord, he shall not go in where there is a dead person. Even if his father or mother or brother or sister should die, he must not defile himself for them, since hair set apart for his God is upon his head. Throughout his term of Nazirite, he is consecrated to the Lord.
Okay, so what is the set of restrictions if you are a Nazir?
Your hair.
You don't
All
touch
right.
your hair.
Hair. And?
Stay away from dead people.
Okay.
All dead people.
Even if it's your own immediate family.
Death defilement, right?
Defilement.
The ritual impurity that comes by being in the same area as somebody who's dead or in contact with the dead is also avoided. So we avoid cutting our hair, we avoid wine, we avoid coming into contact with the dead during this period of Nazirut, of Nazirite vow. You following so far?
Does
Yeah.
this mean his beard too?
Hmm?
Yeah.
The hair of his head?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's part of the head.
Yep. You just let the hair go.
Okay.
Okay. A reminder, just in case you missed it at the very beginning, this is all optional, right? No one is being made a Nazir against their will. No one is saying, you look like you need to be a Nazir today. You're a Nazir from now on. No, it has to be the person's choice.
Is gender equal?
Ish. There is some distinctions in the halakha because of this being a vow. And as we've talked about in the past, in the ancient world, if a woman made a vow while under her father or husband's care, then if he wanted to cancel the vow the moment he heard about it, he had that option. So there was still that inequality of his ability to cancel a vow when it was first made, but a woman could make a vow such as this. And as long as she was either on her own or her male person did not object, then the vow would absolutely be the equivalent of the male's vow. All right, onward for some consequences.
Throughout the term as Nazirite, he is consecrated to the Lord.
I think we read that,
Okay.
didn't we?
If
Yeah,
a
we're on
person
verse
dies
9. Yeah.
suddenly near him, defiling his consecrated hair, he shall shave his head on the day he becomes pure. He shall shave it on the 7th day. On the 8th day he shall bring 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The priest shall offer one as a purification offering and the other as a burnt offering, and make expiation on his behalf for the guilt that he incurred through the corpse. That same day he shall reconsecrate his head and rededicate to the Lord his term as Nazirite. And he shall bring a lamb in its first year as a penalty offering. The previous period shall be void, since his consecrated hair was defiled.
Okay, so death defilement is a big deal because obviously you shouldn't go in knowingly into a place where that will happen, but people could also die. You know, you're go down to sleep one night and you wake up and your spouse is dead. I wasn't planning to be in the same room with a deceased, but they died. Yes. And you now have to reboot your term of Nazirut. You have to restart the clock, if you will, after going through this week process of removing the hair that you had already grown and then having to go through the sacrificial section. Make sense? Or at least understandable?
Would you simply end your vow at that point?
No,
No.
because you made a vow to complete a term of Nazirut, of Nazirite.
A year, 2 years, whatever.
Well, so 30 days was considered the minimum, and it was considered the default if no other time was specified and there was no other reason to suspect you meant longer. So if you said, I want to be a Nazir for as many days as there are grains of sand, that was considered to be a permanent lifetime version. But if you said, I want to be a Nazir, then 30 days was the amount of time that was assumed.
Okay. If an accidental death occurred during that period,
Then it starts it back at 1. Yeah, you go back to the beginning. You don't just take a week break and then resume counting. You go back all the way to the start. Okay, and then we're going to talk about the completion.
Such as the obligation of the
Oops,
Nazirite.
I think we skipped again. 13 is where I believe where we are.
This is the ritual for
Yes.
the Nazirite. On the day that his term as Nazirite is completed, he shall be brought to the entrance of the tent of meeting. As his offering to the Lord, he shall present one male lamb in his first year without blemish for a burnt offering, one ewe lamb in his first year without blemish for a purification offering, one ram without blemish for an offering of well-being, a basket of unleavened cakes of choice flour with mixed oil, with oil mixed in, and unleavened wafers spread with oil, and the proper grain offerings and libations. The priest.
We're going to stop there.
Okay.
Right? So, because the rest goes into the details of how it is offered up and the fact that his hair gets cut and all of the rest of the completion of his term ritual. Okay, so why? Right, why be a Nazir? Why do this? Right, we're going to look at an explanation that will come in our commentary, but I just wanted to ask you if you could possibly imagine why a person would want to do this.
Is it a time of spiritual growth and
Yeah.
meditation? Is it the context for doing something else to draw you closer to God? Or
Well,
is
it certainly can be, right? So you can imagine that if you are burdened by this growing hair, you are especially careful about ritual purity laws regarding the defilement of coming into contact with the dead, such that you are unable to even attend to your own loved ones' needs, and that you are trying to force a clarity, if you will, by avoiding anything that's even remotely possible to be intoxicating from the wine family, then yes, that can absolutely be a good clean slate for a moment of or a period of reflection. So this could be very much an uplift opportunity.
ascetics of other traditions do this to prepare themselves for getting closer to God?
Exactly. It's not unusual for many different religions to have temporary periods of increased dedication that has additional restrictions upon a person. So this very much may be a boost to a spiritual moment. Or it could be the opposite. Right? It could also very much be a break against spiritual decline. That is to say, the person who takes the Nazirite vow may be doing it not because they want to be holier, but because they don't want to be less holy. That is, maybe they've been having some trouble. Specifically in Masechet Sota, there's a discussion where it says that somebody who sees the Sota woman, the woman who's suspected of adultery, in her disgrace, will make a vow not to drink wine because they're going to say, look what happened to her when she got drunk. She got, she was philandering while she was drunk. I don't want that to happen to me. So I better cut, go cold turkey here. And then the additional strictures are there to reinforce that. So there are two different directions that this might be going. It's either meant to elevate us or it's meant to prevent our degradation.
So it could be a very early rehab.
Kind of.
Yeah, not exactly a 12-step program, but need one copy for myself, but
Well,
I
Um,
thought you all told Turkey is the first step, right?
yeah, well, it is,
oh,
you know, you have
Almost.
to spend time away from your bad behavior or your
Yeah.
toxic use and.
all right, so we're going to start off with the page that has the Mishnah. So Nazir 6:1 is our first reading. I couldn't quite fit a title on when I wanted to get all my information on the page, and so title goes. So first, just a quick Mishnah summary of what we're talking about as our restrictions.
3 things are forbidden to a Nazirite: ritual defilement, shaving, and products of the vine. All products of the vine join together to add up to a minimum measure, and he is not liable until he eats an olive's worth of grapes.
All right, so this is a general rule for almost all of the eating things that Judaism talks about, which is it doesn't count as eating until you've had an olive's worth, because that's what a minimal portion would be. It'd be like in the modern world, we'd say, you know, a gram or 2, because if it's less than a gram, it barely even exists. This is how we avoid the obsession about possible stray molecules of grapes coming towards your mouth. You don't need to worry about that. But what they are adding here is that if I have a tiny bit of grapes and a tiny bit of seeds, those can add together to make an olive's worth of total product, and that would be a violation of the vow. So you do have to be careful about how they can add together to make the minimum measure. So you want to be very careful about the ingredients of anything that you're doing when you're doing this vow. And then onward.
According to the earlier Mishnah, until he drinks a quarter of a log of wine. Rabbi Akiva says, even if he soaked his bread in wine and it is enough to make an olive's worth, he is liable.
Right, so even if you're not actually drinking the wine, but you are soaking an olive's worth of bread in the wine, then that would also make you liable for having violated the no drinking prohibition. So pretty straightforward. What we more or less got from the Torah, just a little bit more detail.
Are these Nazirites priests?
No, these are regular people. I mean, a priest could choose to also be a Nazir, but it was not restricted only for the Nazirites. This was something that common people could do.
Was Samuel a Nazarite?
We'll come back to that question. In fact, just a little bit later on this page.
Oh, okay. I see it.
But first, Nazir 7:1.
A high priest and a Nazirite may not defile themselves with their dead relatives, but they may defile themselves with a neglected corpse.
All right, so here's the question, which is, if I'm a Nazir, or if I am a Kohen Gadol, the high priest, I am not supposed to be around anybody who's dead, right? Period. But what about like my family's, and what about a body that has no one else to bury it? Right? I'm walking through the middle of nowhere, and there's a body, and it's my obligation to perform an act of chesed, to give a burial to this body. But if I am a Nazir, I've been told I'm not supposed to touch it, and if I'm a Kohen Gadol, I'm told I'm not supposed to touch it. So how do we balance this? And the argument here is, that indeed for our relatives, we do not. Presumably there is someone else that can do the burial for your relatives. But for a neglected corpse, there is no one else. That's the definition of it being neglected. And therefore, it is your obligation to take care of it. Go on, though, as he tries to, the Mishnah tries to show some distinctions between these two categories of the high priest and the Nazir.
If they were walking on the path and found a neglected corpse, Rabbi Eliezer says, the high priest should defile himself, but not the Nazirite. But the sages say the Nazirite should defile himself, but not the high priest.
All right, so they're arguing about this corpse. Rabbi Eliezer says, actually, the Nazirite should do it, but the high priest, Rabbi Eliezer says that the high priest should defile, but the Nazirite shouldn't. And the sages say, but the Nazirite should, but the high priest shouldn't. Right, so they're saying that there's actually a difference between these two categories. And now we're going to try and get to the argument of why this is the case, why they argue.
Rabbi Eliezer said to them, the priest should defile himself, for he does not offer a sacrifice for his defilement. And the Nazirite should not defile himself, for he does offer a sacrifice on defilement.
Okay, so Rabbi Eliezer is arguing about the severity of the defilement based upon the consequence, the punishment, if you will. If a priest defiles himself, then he is, in quote, punished by sitting through the period of ritual purification and going through that process. Whereas if a Nazirite defiles himself, then he is punished, if you will, by going through the period of ritual purification and offering a sacrifice that goes along with the end of that period and resuming his Nazirite period of his vow. So it seems by the punishment, by the consequences, which is better, but people sometimes get confused, that the Nazirite is a more severe limitation, right? You can tell how severe the problem is by how severe the consequence is. Make sense? That's Rabbi Eliezer's position of how do we understand who really takes priority in this case. The sages say have a different view.
The sages said to him, the Nazirite should defile himself, for his holiness is not permanent, and the priest should not defile himself, for his holiness is permanent.
All right, so you can see what the sages are doing is they're saying it doesn't matter what the relative punishment or consequence are. What matters is what was the actual status of the person whom is now defiling themselves for this corpse. And the Nazirite's holiness, greater consequences it may have when defiled, it's a temporary holiness, right? It's only a temporary process of having this ritual purity that you are trying to maintain above and beyond usual. Whereas for a priest, a high priest in particular, that status is permanent, right? They are of that level of caution 24/7 for the rest of their lives. So that seems to me, say the sages, to be a greater holiness that demands greater protection than the Nazirite's holiness.
Does anyone bring the argument that the community depends on Kohen Gadol for leading the sacrifices?
No, because we can always get another one. We can always, just
Next in line.
next in line, yeah. We in fact, in Mishnah Yoma, when they're talking about Yom Kippur, they specifically say they have a backup. In case the Kohen Gadol becomes ritually defiled right before Yom Kippur begins, and now who can do the Yom Kippur ritual on Yom Kippur? We've got a number two waiting to go, because Yom Kippur doesn't wait for the rest of us. So the idea of having a substitute Kohen Gadol was already in the works. So the Kohen Gadol should never think he's irreplaceable. All right, so we've got another idea here of the limits of what this holiness is, right? Yes, it's important, but of course, taking care of an unattended corpse is something that even a Nazirite should do. You will notice there is a slight differentiation here. What they're trying to say is that if there was a high priest and he came across the corpse, the high priest should take care of it. If there was a Nazirite and they came across the corpse, the Nazirite should take care of it. If there was a high priest and a Nazirite and they came across the corpse, the sages say the Nazirite should take care of it. Right? So the second category where they're arguing about here is only where the two of them are going together. That's where our distinction is.
So if a Nazirite and high priest were walking by a bar,
It does sound like the beginning of one of those stories. So the high priest and the Nazirite are walking through the street. Suddenly, there's a body. Which one of them?
And no one knows it.
And there's no one else around. Okay. Now, as Don mentioned, we have another question of, well, do we have any examples of Nazirite from Jewish tradition? Now, there's one that you might all know by name. Who is the most famous long-haired Nazirite? Samson. All right, so everyone knows Samson because he is specifically called to be a Nazirite through the very special prophecy of his birth and onwards. Not a very good one, I should point out. He is not an exemplary Nazirite, nor is he an exemplary person. But God worked with the material he had at that time. But the question is, do we have other people who are also Nazirites? And as you already mentioned, there's a question about Samuel. All right, so why might we think Samuel was a Nazirite? Let's see what evidence we have.
Samuel was a Nazirite according to the words of Rabbi Nehorai. as it says, and no razor morah shall come upon his head.
All right, so from the book of Samuel, when Hannah is dedicating her son,
Right.
she says that there will be no razor to come on his head, which sounds very much like the limits of being a Nazir. But there's a problem with that, which is it's only one of the limits of being a Nazir. Whereas when we talked to Samson's parents, when they were getting their instructions, the rest of these were also mentioned. So Samuel gets 1 out of 3 explicitly mentioned. Is that a hint that he was a Nazir, or was it just its own vow, but not with all the rest of what went on with being a Nazir? So Rabbi Nahorai says, yes, this meant that he was a full-fledged Nazir, just like Samson, although a much better person than Samson. Onward, however.
Because it says with reference to Samson, and no razor morah, and just as morah in the case of Samson teaches that he was a Nazirite, so morah in the case of Samuel teaches that he also was a Nazirite.
All right, so this is what's known as Gezer Shava, which means that you make an assumption based upon the usage of a word in 2 different places. That in one place, the meaning of the word is explicit, and the implications of the word illegally are explicit. And in our case, the same word is used. And so we can assume that the implications are also the same, that there is an identical meaning behind our word, even if it wasn't as explicit as it was in the other text. This is a very, very standard midrashic technique for analyzing the text and helping us to use one part of the Bible to unpack other parts of the Bible, because every part references every other part. It's a beautiful web of interpretation built into the text itself. However, it is open to argumentation because not everyone agrees that your interpretation of how those words should be understood applies in this case, which is why we get pushback.
Rabbi Yosei says, but does not morah refer to fear of flesh and blood?
All right, so here's where Hebrew, just like English, has this wonderful problem of homonyms, of words or homophones, right? Words that sound the same, but mean different things. There's homonyms. They're actually spelt the same, not only sound the same. Anyway, it's those words that mean that mean different things, but they sound and look the same. Like horn and horn, right? If I say I honked the horn on my car, no one is thinking that I was like pushing my hand down on a unicorn spike, right? It's not that kind of horn. It's the horn. And the same thing if I say, I cut off the horn of a wildebeest, no one thinks that the wildebeest had a little horn sticking off the side of its body and I was removing it. By context. Sometimes the context is unclear. And so here, what Rabbi Yosei is saying is that when Hannah was dedicating him, she wasn't saying no razor shall come upon his head. She was saying no fear will come upon his head. But since obviously Yirat Shamayim, fear of heaven, should be with everybody, especially someone as pious as Samuel, therefore she must have meant no fear of mortals, that he would never be afraid of flesh and blood people, but would always hold God in the highest esteem. So everyone following that logic? Okay, which therefore breaks our connection, right? If it's fear with Samuel, but razor with Samson, then we can't learn that Samuel was a Nazirite. However,
Rabbi Nahorai said to him, but does it not also say, and Samuel said, how can I go? If Saul will hear it, he will kill me, which shows that he was afraid of flesh and blood.
Right? So, well, is he really not afraid? Because he seems to be afraid of Saul when he's going to, what's the term? When you anoint, going to anoint David as being the new king. He knows Saul is not going to be happy about this, and he is worried that Saul will kill him. And if he's worried that Saul will kill him, and it's such a degree that he is telling God, I'm not sure if I can do this, then that seems to be that he does have fear of flesh and blood. And so the answer of whether or not Samuel was a Nazirite is, we don't know. He might have been, or he might not have been. At least the text we have is ambiguous. However, there are texts we don't have which remove that ambiguity. So the following passage is taken from the USCJ, United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism's translation and commentary on the Mishnah, which is the text that we use on my Mishnah class on Wednesday nights, not while I'm on vacation, but the Wednesday class that we do otherwise uses this text. And the commentary was written by Rabbi Joshua Kolb, and he has the following interesting tidbit to share with us.
Interestingly, in a fragmentary scroll of Samuel found at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, instead of reading, "For when he has appeared before the Lord, he must remain there for good," reads, "He will be a Nazirite for good for all his life."
All right, so there is a different edit in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls that is the same book of Samuel in other respects, except it explicitly identifies Samuel as being a Nazir. Interesting. Onward.
Ben Sirah, a 2nd century BCE book, writes that Samuel was a prophetic Nazirite. The Septuagint, the 3rd century BCE translation of the Bible into Greek, adds to verse 11, "And he shall not drink wine or strong drink." Josephus, too, states that Samuel didn't drink wine.
All right, so if we get Josephus and we have the Septuagint also adding in wine as a limit, now we've got two of the criteria of being a Nazir. And so the idea that he was probably an unspoken Nazir seems a little stronger in those cases, and which is why he summarizes it as follows.
All of this proves that there was a strong trend in Second Temple Judaism to view Samuel as a Nazirite.
But we can't say definitively. Right? The other books that are being mentioned here are non-canonical. They are not considered part of the Bible itself. They are certainly illustrative of what were the opinions of people during the time of the Second Temple period, which is the time the Mishnah itself was also written, which is why having Rabbi Nahorai have the opinion that he was a Nazir fits perfectly within the culture of that time and what was probably a lively debate in rabbinic circles. But we cannot say conclusively one way or the other, because the fragment that we have from the book of Samuel only mentions the hair probably, and therefore we cannot conclusively say that he was or was not a Nazir.
But it would have certainly set him apart from Eli and his sons.
Well, his own moral behavior set him apart from Eli's sons. I mean, the fact that they were just wretches made him distinct. And the fact that he was dedicated from outside of the priesthood also made him a very special person. And the fact that that led to his neviut, his prophecy, his ability to be a prophet, is also what made him very different. We don't have to put the bell and whistle on of being also a Nazir to make him distinct and special. It's what's the term of gilding the lily, right? It's an extra level of specialness that isn't required for us to still respect and see how he was distinct in his generation. But he might have been. You know, the razor in verse 11 is definitely a hint that he might have been a Nazir, but we can't say one way or the other for sure.
But that's his mother making the vow.
Yes.
So we don't know. So can another person make a Nazirite vow for you?
So we get this twice. We get this with Samson, but there it was under the instruction of an angel. And so it's kind of like, you know, all bets are off when an angel's telling you what to do. But in the second case, it seems like she is dedicating him, whether or not it's a sufficient dedication to override his own choice when he grows up. That's a trickier topic, yes, of whether or not a person can make a vow for an infant that is binding even when they reach the age of majority.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a Jewish Muslim.
Be careful, parents. Yeah. I vow he grows up, he'll be a doctor.
You better study.
All right. So I told you at the beginning, we're also going to talk about why someone might do this. And this is the point where we're going to get into that topic, right? Hannah, we understand she might have done it because of her feelings of gratitude to God for finally allowing her to have this son. Samson, we understand because the angel was trying to come and harness Samson's expected abilities in a way that would be helpful for the Jewish people rather than hurtful. he still was hurtful to the Jewish people. It's also important to remember. So there might have been a question of pointing the loaded cannon in the right direction towards the enemies. So perhaps Samuel was for good, and Samson was to diminish the bad. That kind of idea hopefully will help you understand what Sefer HaChinuch has to say about the root of all of this commandment.
I have already written an introduction at the beginning of the book that there be something in the world of the Holy One, blessed be he, that combines physicality and intellect, humanity.
Right. That's the unique thing in this entire universe that combines those two elements of being a byword in Middle Ages in the Middle Ages philosophy of being like the soul, the highest elements of the soul, not merely our breathing, living type of soul, but the actual unique human capacity for transcendental thought and experience, plus the fact that we're flesh and blood. It's unique to find those two things combined in God's universe, because everything else is either one or the other. We're the unique combination.
It was something fitting and necessary for his praise to come up properly from his creatures, that with this creature there would not be lacking any possibilities, which we have in our minds to grasp from his world. And there is no doubt that without this reason that obligates our intellect to dwell within the physical, which is involved with desire and sin, it would have been fitting for our intellect to stand and serve in front of our Creator and to recognize his honor like one of the angels that are stationed with him.
All right, let me pause and try and decode some of that for you. So yes, medieval philosophy is not always readily accessible to 21st century language. So what he's trying to say is that God created this very special creature that was a mix of physical as well as intellect. And that was necessary in order for us to be in this world, right? Otherwise, we could have just been angels. And God could have just made our souls stand next to God, next to, in the most metaphorical of senses, and simply experience God's radiance and praise God in that capacity. But God had angels. He had plenty of them. What he wanted was a creature that was both physical and spiritual. And that way it could transform its travels, its experiences in this world into spiritual growth, enlightenment, betterment, whatever you want to call it, that would not be possible if it were simply a static, unchanging angel at God's side. And that means we're here, right? And we have our job to do, and we have the Torah to help us do it, and all of the other things that comes along with Judaism. So he's basically trying to explain the premise of why we exist in this way that we exist. Make sense? Okay, because understanding that is going to be necessary for understanding what comes next.
However, because of this obligation,
meaning that we be in this world in order to experience this world and give praise to God from this world,
it being our souls,
right,
it is subjugated to live in physical houses. Thus,
that's what we call our bodies.
Right. Thus, it must occasionally veer from the service of its creator to tend to the needs of its home where it lives. For a home structure and its lumber and its stones cannot stand without a person minding it.
Okay, so the fact that you have to eat, sleep, go to the bathroom, take a shower, have a job, work in the field, whatever is necessary to keep your house alive, to keep it moving so the soul has a place to reside in this physical world, that's fine. And yes, that means that you have to stop praying. It means you have to stop studying. It means you have to stop living the perfect, absolute spiritual life that you might hope for. But that's okay, right? That's part of your duty in this world, is to keep the body moving, to keep the house in repair. Make sense? Right? Very, very important, very balanced. Something that a lot of people get wrong, because a lot of people will focus too much on the house, and other people will neglect their house. And in both cases, Judaism says are a problem.
If so, as the intention of man's creation was according to what we have said, whenever the intellect can minimize physical work and focus on the service of its master, that is good for it, so long as it does not completely ignore the work of the house and destroy it.
Yeah. Our primary job is to connect to God through this world, but we cannot ignore the house in the process. And he's going to give some even better encouragement.
As this would also be considered a sin for him, as the king wished to have a creature like this.
And just pause real quick. Just savor that for a moment, right? God wanted us to be physical creatures. It isn't that somehow we're flawed because we're physical. It isn't that somehow we are degraded because we are physical. We are exactly and uniquely what God wants us to be. And this existence that we have, with all of its perils and turmoil, is exactly where we need to exist to be able to have this unique experience among all of God's creations. We just have to get the balance right. Onward.
It is like the saying of Rabbi Kosei, Tani, that a person may not afflict himself on a fast day.
Which means you cannot afflict over and above what the fast day is already giving you. There are people who think that if one fast day is good, then 10 must be better. No, that's called starvation, which is which is not only frowned upon. I mean, think about it. We just had the holiday of Shavuot. Right? How many days did we celebrate Shavuot? 2, exactly. How many days do we celebrate the first moments of Pesach? 2. How many days of Sukkot?
2.
Rosh Hashanah?
1. Oh, I'm sorry, 2.
Yom Kippur?
1.
1. Right? It's like, wait a minute. If all the other days we have an additional day to celebrate or commemorate as needed, why would not Yom Kippur, the holiest of holy days, we also should be doubling it? But we don't, because doubling the fast would mean fasting for 2 days running. And for most people, that would be debilitating, to say the least, especially given the spiritual needs of the day and the amount of energy we burn in those endeavors. All right, so onward he adds, though, which Rav Yehuda explained.
Which Rav Yehuda explained in the name of Rav as stemming from the verse, and man was a living thing.
Right? We were made to live. We were made to be alive, which Ecclesiastes tries to explain.
On the same basis, the wise king stated, do not be overly righteous. Do not be overly wise. Why should you be desolate?
All right, so the question would be, if maybe I should just try and make myself this ascetic who lives in a cave and only drinks, water that's dripped from the cave and eat the lichen off the rock. No, right? That would be overly righteous. How can you be overly righteous? Well, you can be overly righteous by being so pious that you're actually harming your ability to live in this world. And you're degrading your ability to experience this world the way God wants you to live in this world. So this should all be building up an image that perhaps being a Nazir is not such a great thing. Right? Maybe being a Nazir is not what everyone should aspire to do. That deliberately limiting what you can eat as well as how you are living in the world, maybe that is not a primary goal that we should all strive for. Certainly not 24/7. Onward.
And this is the holiness of the Nazirite and his loftiness as he departs from the physical.
Right? But there is a holiness that comes with departing from the physical. So there is both this danger of being overly ascetic as well as the benefit of leaving the physical behind, at least temporarily. And trying to make sure we get that right mix for the right reason is where the magic comes in for being a Nazir. And that's where we're going to a story that comes from the Talmud.
Shimon the righteous said, in all my days as a priest, I never ate the guilt offering of an impure Nazirite, apart from one man who came to me from the south.
All right, we're going to pause there before we get his story. So what he's saying is, as we talked about, if someone is impure, the body drops dead to them suddenly, and they have to come and they make a sacrifice, well, that meat gets eaten. And he's saying, I would never eat from that sacrifice. Now, I'm allowed to eat from it, but I did not want to eat it, says the priest, the Kohen, because I didn't really consider anyone who was a Nazir to be a Nazir for the right reason. And therefore, their sacrifice, which I was entitled to, I refrained from eating because it was my own way of passively aggressively criticizing their choice. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. But one guy, his I ate.
His beautiful eyes and a fine countenance, and his locks were arranged in curls. I said to him, my son, what did you see to destroy this hair?
Right, because ultimately a Nazir will be bald. Yes, they may have long hair for a while, but you would have had normal hair to start with, and then you get through the whole shaving process. So you're going to go through both long bedraggled hair as well as shaved hair. So why in the world, when you're so gorgeous, would you have ever undertaken the vow of a Nazirite, which is going to end up ruining your hair? Make sense? Onward.
He said to me, I was a shepherd from my father in my town, and I went to draw water from the spring.
Now, remember, of course, shepherds are not meek little wimpy boys, right? Shepherds are strong men, right? They are he-men. So he would have been a robust man. This is not trying to portray him as being a meek little thing. This is saying he would have had some nice muscle on his frame, in addition to his nice face and beautiful hair.
And I looked at my reflection, and my evil inclination quickly rose against me and sought to drive me from the world.
All right, so what? What's that mean? What happened when he looks in his mirror?
He fell in love.
With himself.
Yeah, it's a little narcissism, right? He looks in the water and says, boy, I look good.
Yeah.
And at that moment, that's the Yetzer Hara, right? When he starts feeling that sense of pride, that sense of arrogance, that sense of narcissism, that is what he realizes is the first step towards pushing you out of the world. Now, pushing you out of the world doesn't literally mean like, here's the door, but it means you're now moving from the world you're supposed to be in into a world of indulgence, debauchery, criminality, immorality, all the other problems that can come once you start thinking so much of yourself. And so he feels that rise up in him, and he responds.
I said to my evil inclination, wicked one, for what reason are you proud in a world that is not yours?
All right, you didn't make this world.
About one who in the future will be maggots and worms.
And that body that I'm staring at, and that reflection that's so pretty, it's going to be in the dirt, rotting one day. So why are you giving me this feeling of pride? When I look in that, what I should be thinking of is I came from nothing and I go to something even worse.
The temple service.
The temple service was the way that someone would make an oath.
Right.
It'd be like saying in modern, English, by God or something like that. That this was the idiomatic way of taking an oath.
That I will shave you for the sake of heaven. Immediately I arose and kissed him on his head. And
this is the priest again.
And said to him, my son, may there be more Nazirites like you in Israel. With regard to you, the verse states, when either a man or a woman shall clearly utter a vow, the vow of a Nazirite to consecrate himself to the Lord.
All right, so this is Shimon the righteous, Hatzadik, is saying, this is what being a Nazir should be about. It's about conquering yourself. It's about pushing yourself further because you felt yourself slipping. So that idea of maybe this was to prevent something bad or maybe this was to help you go higher, it's both, right? Becoming a Nazir in the ancient world was about trying to push off from the negative feelings so that you ended up higher than you were before. It wasn't just holding them back. It was meant as a spiritual launch point from having recognized that, from recoiling from that emotion so that you end up better than you were when you started, not just holding steady. So the two ideals of the Nazirite vow that we've been sort of toying with are not really opposites. They're part of the same process. Right? You feel yourself slump, and that lets you jump higher by using the Nazirite as their own self-correction technique.
Therefore, in order to suppress the inclination, he is commanded to shave his head at the end of the days of his term, and he is not permitted to fix it up and take a little of them, so that his impulse does not come back against him as at first. Rather, he has become obligated to shave it all.
Right, it's not just a marine crew cut, right? It is all of it gone.
For there is no doubt that both very long hair and completely shaven heads destroy the appearance of a person.
My apologies to anyone who's bald. But for those that did not come by it honestly, the idea of stripping all the hair off your head willingly, or the idea that you would have long, unkept hair, both of those are not going to make a person more attractive. Right? Long hair can be attractive, but it is not the Nazirite type of long hair. It does require a great deal of styling and care, which the Nazirite was not allowed to give. No, you're not getting little trims here and there during your period. You are letting it go. And that letting it go is precisely the idea of controlling that inclination in you that would dwell too much on your own pride and arrogance and potential narcissism.
So you give one is pride, pleasure.
You could try and map that to all of them.
Yeah.
But really, it's just a question of being able to take yourself in hand and discipline yourself in a way that diminishes your adoration of the physical, right? That diminishes your feeling that the physical is the point of your existence, right? Because it's not the point of our existence. It's necessary, as the Sefer HaChinuch made, I hope, abundantly clear. You got to take care of the house, absolutely. Right? Day in, day out, you should be combing your hair and washing as needed and, feeding yourself and doing all of those things is good and proper. But that's not the point of your existence. So if you let it become the point of your existence, then you need to rededicate away from the physical in order to make it clear. But unfortunately, what Shimon HaTzadik was arguing, Shimon the righteous, was that most people don't become a Nazir for the right reason. They probably become a Nazir either to show off, or they become a Nazir as some form of, I feel holy, so I want to do this. That's not the idea. Nazir is there to guide you away from something that's a problem so that you end up stronger than you were before. And those circumstances are quite rare. We don't have the ability to be a Nazir in the modern world, but to respond when you feel a negative emotion, when you feel anger, to say, not only will I not be anger, but I will compensate by doing something good and kind for a person. That would be a more modern equivalent of what's happening with this Nazirite process. If you identify this instinct, this feeling, this impulse in you that is of a negative type, and you not only stop it and prevent it, that's step one always, but you compensate beyond it by doing the opposite of what it was intending you to do. And in so doing, you train yourself that those types of emotions are not welcome, and that you will not act on those impulses, but will repair in their honor, if you will. Good. All right. Thank you all very much. See you all in about a month.
Have a good vacation.
Thank you.
Enjoy.
Have a wonderful, safe trip.
Thank you. It should always be a safe trip for everyone in Israel.
Yeah.
The computer's not letting me stop. How do I stop?
No, I just want to, I don't.
Did you read about a month or so ago about in Israel, they somehow found old pottery in different areas, and scientists, I guess, got beer, that they
Oh, you mean they found the old, they remade the beer using the old version, yes.
Yeah. And there was more than one version or variety of beer.
Where?
Yeah, they went back to, yeah.
But in Egypt, there's a long tradition of beer making going back thousands of years.
Yeah, in fact, the
There was a
article
news
goes,
article that
what-
some archaeologists took the residue from some pottery or pottery shards and reactivated the yeasts and made some beer.
That's it, yeah.
Whoa,
The article reads, what beer did the Pharaohs drink or something like
I
that?
guess that you could sequence the leftover.
Well, you don't even have to do that. It's
Yeast.
like getting the dried yeast in the packet, only it was on the inside of the
Clay
jugs.
jug, they would make it in clay
Yeah.
jugs.
They were able to extract the dormant yeasts from the clay, from the inside of the jug, scrape it off or something. And all you have to do is
Isn't
get
it
it
like
and
the
give it food.
sourdough in San Francisco?
Yeah,
They
they had
would-
dried out bits of sourdough that had been 100 years in a dry
And they still-
place, and you moistened it and gave it the right food, yeah, to grow.
That's like how they
Yeah.
get DNA from ancient archaeological human remains.
Yeah,
Now it makes
yeah.
sense. You first have to get it moistened and reconstituted, that way you.
Well, except that the DNA that they get that way is broken up much smaller. The yeast is just like the individual cells, they have
Coating,
pieces
right.
around them to protect them from the dryness. So it's just like,
Waiting.
a mouse in hibernation.
Right, or like anthrax. spore,
Yeah,
you know.
exactly. Yeah.
But
It's like that,
Yeah,
right.
the DNA extraction
Right.
is a much more difficult process.
Right.
But
Well, you-
they say, they even looked at ancient Egyptian writings, and they talk about beer.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
we
yeah.
gotta remember, it
Because
mentions
it's,
several different kinds of beer.
Yeah,